On this most auspicious of nights, permit me then, in lieu of the more commonplace sobriquet, to suggest the character of this dramatis persona. Voila! In view, a humble vaudevillian veteran cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate. This visage, no mere veneer of vanity, is a vestige of vox populi, now vacant, vanished. However, this valorous visitation of a bygone vexation stands vivified and has vowed to vanquish these venal and virulent vermin, vanguarding vice and vouchsafing the violently vicious and voracious violation of volition. The only verdict is vengeance, a vendetta, held as a votive, not in vain, for the value and veracity of such shall one day vindicate the vigilant and the virtuous. Verily, this vichyssoise of verbiage veers most verbose, so let me simply add, it's my very good honour to meet you, and you may call me V. I actually did it! Oh my god! Oh my god, I actually did the entire speech from beginning to end in one take! Oh my god! Months! It has taken me months to learn that off by heart, and I finally did it! Oh, sorry mate, it wasn't recording, we're gonna have to do the whole thing again. What? Hello everyone and welcome to another Rewind review. In this video, as you've most likely guessed, we are taking a look at V for Vendetta, based on the DC and Vertigo graphic novel from Alan Moore and David Lloyd. The 2005 movie takes place in a future British dystopian society where a shadowy freedom fighter known only by the alias of V plots to overthrow the tyrannical government with the help of a young woman. Adapted for screen by Lana and Lily Wachowski and directed by James McTeague, V for Vendetta stars Hugo Weaving, Natalie Portman, John Hurt, Stephen Fry, Stephen Ree, Tim Pigott-Smith, Rupert Graves and Roger Allam. I'm still amazed that I managed to do that intro. It may not seem that hard, but for me it is. You don't see all the mistakes and fumbles I make when I make these videos. I set myself a challenge back in January to do that intro, so it has quite literally taken me months to learn it. But I did it! Also, just before we start, I do want to very quickly mention why I said that this movie came out in 2005, and why I've listed it as 2005 on this video. Even though the worldwide distribution of this movie was in 2006, I think everywhere, including the UK, it was out in 2006. For all intents and purposes, this movie officially came out in 2005. It's listed as that on IMDb. So that's why I've listed it as 2005. Sorry for any confusion. Right, V for Vendetta. I'll be honest, the first time that I encountered this movie, I wasn't aware that it was a DC comic book. It just didn't seem like something that they would do. The first time I saw this movie was years ago. I remember it being on TV quite late at night, and I think my mum was the one who put me onto it. Yeah, it was my mum. She said it looked quite interesting, and she also thought that Pierce Brosnan was the one playing V. That's actually a casting choice I wouldn't mind seeing. And while I liked it, and I remember thinking that it was good, it was a little bit complicated for me. I was quite young when I saw this, maybe mid-teens, so there was quite a few elements that I didn't really get or found hard to follow. But it's a film that I would come back to quite a few times over the years, and as I got older I started to understand it a lot better. And now, 20 years on the best day that I could possibly release this video, I hope, I'm revisiting this movie once again with a much deeper and better understanding. And while I can't say that this is a flawless movie, it is still really good. It's barely dated, and slightly unsettlingly, it has become much more relevant in recent years. So let's dive into V for Vendetta. Taking place over the span of a year, a young woman called Evey Hammond, an average citizen of the United Kingdom which is now under the rule of the fascist and tyrannical Norsefire Party, finds herself becoming an enemy of the state after a chance encounter with an enigmatic and larger-than-life freedom fighter known only as V. After this encounter, Evey is reluctantly forced to stay in his underground lair, but a bond soon forms between the two. Meanwhile, as V's explosive plan is set in motion, a police inspector hot on his trail begins to gradually reveal V's mysterious past, which leaves him starting to question everything his government stands for. So there is quite a lot happening in this movie with lots of moving parts, and it's complex enough for me to say that when you do watch this movie, you do need to pay attention. Fortunately, there's no mucking around. It not only jumps straight into the thick of it, it focuses on the most important aspects. It never drags, and I think the pacing is just right for the 132-minute runtime. I don't think it's always obvious just how much time has actually passed in this movie because, as I said, the entire story takes place over the span of a year, and outside of the odd line of dialogue like "nothing's happened in weeks," there's no clear indicator, and I will admit there is a few elements that do feel a bit rushed or skimmed over, particularly when it comes to certain characters' development. To be fair, it's much more than the comic does. Now, I will openly admit I have yet to read the graphic novel. I would like to, I have it, in fact I have it right here, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. That said, I did have a look into the differences between the comic book and the film, and I can definitely understand why it is that comic book purists aren't happy with the film. In fact, some downright hate it. In fact, Alan Moore, the co-creator of the comic, in true Alan Moore fashion, has pretty much distanced himself from this entirely. He isn't even credited as one of the writers. It wasn't the first time and it definitely wasn't the last. Anyway, but there is quite a few differences between the two versions of this story, some for the better and some for the worst. Even though it is inherently a British-focused story, I do understand why some elements were changed so that it would be a bit more appealing to American audiences, especially since the graphic novel was a critique of Margaret Thatcher's conservative Britain in the 1980s, so it needed updating for the 2000s. And because of those changes, it's still relevant today. In fact, it's scarily more so. There's things that happen in this that either have happened or feel like they could, which is a bit unsettling. In fact, just V saying something as simple as, "There is something terribly wrong with this country." I guarantee that most of the people watching this movie will say, "He's got a point, you know." And not just people in the UK. I don't want to get too political here, that's not what this channel's for. But it is hard not to address certain things considering what this movie tackles. It deals with some very heavy and deep themes and ideas. It's a very mature story, and that's why I found it a bit hard to follow when I was younger. But ironically, it's not done in the most subtle way. Even the symbolism in sequences like the domino scene. To be fair, that is an amazing scene, and apparently took 4 professional domino assemblers around 200 hours to set up 22,000 pieces. Could you imagine if they accidentally knocked that over right at the end? I think violence would be chosen, and I wouldn't blame them. Anyway, I won't lie, there are still a few moments that do confuse me a little bit. I get the intention behind them. Again, I'm guessing it's symbolism. Earlier in the movie, you see certain characters getting kidnapped or killed, and yet they appear in the crowd outside Parliament. They're one of the people wearing masks. Are they meant to be there in spirit or something else? I don't know. As I said, I do get what the intention most likely is, but it did throw me a bit, or I could just be reading too much into it. Anyway, one thing I do like is that, even though this is meant to be essentially a dystopian totalitarian version of the UK, it's done in a way that keeps it quite grounded and believable, partly because of the overall style of the film. Yes, there is some comic book flair at times, but a good chunk of the film looks and feels like a gritty London thriller. I really love the production design overall. The sets, the locations that they use throughout this movie are brilliant, especially V's lair. That looks awesome. There's some excellent cinematography and colour grading in this. It looks gorgeous, and far more like a comic book than most of the other comic book movies that were out at the time. There's some really artistically creative shots in this that do look like they were ripped out of a comic book. It probably helps that the Wachowskis were the ones who wrote the screenplay for this, and truth be told, I was convinced that they directed it as well. It does have a bit of a Matrix vibe at times, but no. But what else adds to that sense of realism is the way that this dystopian world is portrayed and how it's shown to work. It's not a full-on science fiction dystopia like things like The Hunger Games or even things like Equilibrium, which does have a few parallels to this. That actually came out a few years before this. Got absolutely panned as well. It's a bit of a shame because it's actually not bad. Anyway, it uses real-world issues and history to paint a rather bleak but believable picture of a totalitarian Britain. In this, you see things like police brutality and corruption. You see curfews being put in place, laws being put in place to make being gay illegal. There's almost total surveillance with people being spied on. You see how media and news outlets are being used to influence, sway, cover up, and manipulate the general consensus. They even very lightly touch on how religion can be used to sway things as well. You see through some not so subtle imagery how someone in a position of power can use hate and fear to manipulate people into gaining more power, and how easy it is for people to just embrace conformity and apathy. There's also a huge emphasis on censorship being used as well on chat shows and various forms of media, which culminates in a pretty brutal and hard to watch sequence with Stephen Fry's character. Even though they don't explicitly say it, and I could be misremembering here, those censorships also include art forms being banned like books, music, film, and even food ingredients. And at a guess, I would also say that art galleries and museums would most likely be censored as well. Again, this isn't official, it's all just implied. Also, I do find it funny that this even finds time to make a point of all electronic historical documents being erased for something that they're looking for. But here's the physical copy. I'm sure that won't be a big issue going forwards. It is a heavy movie, definitely. It's not a fun time. And it's not an action movie either. But it is extremely watchable and very, very good. And one of the biggest reasons why is the characters. It may be a movie that is very deep and thought-provoking with its themes and messaging, but this is a very character-driven movie. And leading the show as V is Hugo Weaving. It's taken me a long time to realise just how good his performance is as V, but nowadays, I honestly believe this is one of the greatest performances in a comic book adaptation ever. Almost the entire time he's on screen, you never see his face. He's always wearing a mask, mainly the Guy Fawkes mask. But it's astonishingly good how well he's able to bring so much depth, character, and emotion through just his voice and physicality. He has a very eloquent way of speaking with lots of poetry, phrases, and sayings. There's some proper tongue twisters he comes out with in this, and I will admit, not everything he says I understand. I found that out the hard way. I'm still baffled I managed to do that intro. Anyway, I like that there is a bit of grey to his actions as well. He's not exactly exactly a hero. He does do some very extreme and questionable things. He's a killer, he incites anarchy, he's going to blow up parliaments like Guy Fawkes was going to do, hence the mask. Yes, for those that don't know, Guy Fawkes was a real person and the gunpowder plot was a real thing. And that's why we have Bonfire Night on the 5th of November. It's also the reason I have so much trouble recording videos towards the end of October, because people keep setting off fireworks. It's bloody annoying. Anyway, but it's done in a way that works for this world that he inhabits. And I like how his motivations change a bit as the film goes on. It's a personal vendetta that he has. He's targeting people who made him who he is. They just happen to be the ones in charge. But that changes over the course of the movie through his interactions with Evey. And this is all reflected in the inclusion of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is all just my takeaway, by the way. That's how it feels to me. And he is a genuinely amazing character, played perfectly by an incredible actor. And then, when it comes to Evey, she is brilliant. And Natalie Portman, even with a slightly mixed London accent, delivers an amazing performance. Evey is the character that goes through the biggest transformation in this story. And while I personally think this is one of the times where it can feel a tad rushed, the journey she goes on is brilliant. You do feel quite bad for her because of what she's put through. And that whole sequence where she's imprisoned and interrogated is pretty hard to watch, even after you know what's going on. And I can't deny that is an amazing and emotional sequence with a brilliant payoff. She feels like a completely different character by the end of this. And Natalie Portman is on top form with a brilliant and committed performance. Don't forget, that scene where she gets her head shaved, that was done for real and for this movie. I always thought it was because she was working on Star Wars at the time and she normally wears wigs when she plays Padme. So I was quite surprised finding out that it was purely for this role. That's dedication. Well done. She, like Hugo, is absolutely phenomenal. Likewise, the two police inspectors that are investigating V are both really good too. Dominic, played by Rupert Graves, doesn't have a huge amount to do, but he is good. But Finch, played by Stephen Ree, is excellent. He doesn't really have a big impact on the overall story, but he is an integral part in uncovering V's past and finding the motive behind why V is targeting who he does. And I love how he changes as well the deeper he goes. I do find it slightly funny that both Stephen Ree and Rupert Graves seem destined to play police officers. Rupert actually played Inspector Lestrade in the Sherlock TV series, which coincidentally actually nicked the finale of this movie in season 3. Anyway, they're both brilliant and I feel like everyone in this movie is pretty spot on for their roles. I will say, the Chancellor played by John Hurt, the politicians and the higher-ups are a bit flat. They are quite two-dimensional characters. Quite literally, because the majority of time you see him on screen, he's basically just a giant head on a TV screen. Not saying the performances aren't great though, everyone does do some really good work here, but they just aren't the most developed antagonists. I've also got to give a shout out to Stephen Fry as well in the small role he plays. I really like how that character is used in this story and his performance is great. Everyone is on top form in this. As I said, this is a character-driven movie with thematic elements and not an action movie as it was initially advertised. I recently rewatched a few of the trailers for this movie and it really surprised me how much they actually pushed the Matrix angle. But that isn't to say that it doesn't have any action whatsoever. It does have some, and what it does have is pretty good. It's very well choreographed, has great stunt work, and it's used when the story needs it. Same with the pretty decent visual and practical effects as well. Fun fact, Chad Stahelski and David Leitch, who both worked on the Matrix trilogy and the John Wick series, worked on this as well. And I didn't know that. This may be an R-rated movie in the US and a 15 over here, but I appreciate that this isn't a gore fest and overly violent. It wouldn't work within the tone of the film and it would feel quite gratuitous as well, at least in my opinion. It does have some blood splatter and there are a few on-screen deaths, but those are usually when V is fighting people. You never see him killing the people he's targeting. That's all left to the imagination. You get the idea. I did question just how strong and athletic V is meant to be at times, because there are quite a few moments where he does come across as a little bit superhuman, but it's fine. It's a comic book adaptation. And lastly, the soundtrack from Dario Marianelli. It's pretty good. It's very orchestral and moody at times, and I think it really suits the tone of this movie quite well. Plus, the use of classical music like the 1812 Overture is perfect. But I can't not single out the piece of soundtrack that plays during the rooftop sequence. That is such an iconic and powerful sequence, and the soundtrack just ingrains it into your mind. In fact, that track has been used in several other projects and marketing over the years, the most notable of which being the first trailer for Interstellar. That soundtrack was honestly one of the reasons why that trailer was so good. It's absolutely marvellous and 100% worth listening to. The entire soundtrack is really good and it is used in this really well. Overall, this is a movie that is still fantastic and is aged extremely well. No, this isn't the most faithful adaptation of its source material, and yes, there are some moments that could have been expanded on, and some thematic elements that could have been done a little bit subtler. But the story it tells, the characters and performances, the visuals, the sound design, the music, the action, and its mature themes make this into something that is absolutely worth seeing. I've really grown to love this over the years. It's thought-provoking, it's engaging and gripping in equal measure, and I think this is definitely among my favourite comic book movies. So with all that being said, my rating for V for Vendetta is a 9 out of 10. Well, that is pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so if you have watched this video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please be sure to like, subscribe and hit that notification button. If you have seen V for Vendetta, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Plus, if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like to see me do in the future, let me know down below. But until next time, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you in the next video. See you guys.